Konnichiwa. Josh and Sari asked me to come and do portfolio reviews, and I said sure, as long as I could talk a little bit first about comics and stories, so that when I am looking at portfolios, some of the comments that I say might make a little bit more sense in the context of what I'm looking for when I'm at the work. So that's what I'm going to do now. But first, very important thing, my name. My name is pronounced David. I also have a long Italian last name that's very easy to say if you understand the rules of Italian. All of you know how to say pizza, so you should know how that part is said. And if you know how to say zucchini, you shouldn't have any trouble with this part right here. So the proper Italian pronunciation is Mazzucchelli. Now, a lot of people say Mazzucchelli. That's acceptable. A lot of people say Mazzucchelli. That is not acceptable. Right. Enough of that. People come up to me all the time and say, Mr. Mazzucchelli, how do you draw comics? That's a lie. People do not come up to me all the time and say that. If they did, I would say, let's look at your question. How do you draw comics? Let's look at the word draw first. Certainly drawing is vital to making comics. Without drawing, there are no comics, right? But it's not just about how well you draw. Making comics is not just making beautiful drawings, making interesting drawings. Drawing in comics has very particular function. If you're drawing in a life drawing class and you're drawing a figure, your concerns might be with things like the gesture of the pose, or light and shadow, or form, or the way the figure interacts with the surroundings. And what you're doing there is you're taking the act of seeing and translating that into an arrangement of marks. When you draw a figure on a comics page, you're bringing on a whole new set of questions. Things like, what's she doing? What's she thinking? What's going to happen? What just happened? Because in comics, the function of drawing is always to tell a story. And that's what the majority of comics are, telling a story of some kind. So as a comic book artist, your job really is that of a storyteller. And even if you say, well, I just want to draw the comics, I don't want to write the stories, still, you have a responsibility as the artist of a comic to take the writer's script and interpret that in visual terms. Because no matter how good the writer is, it's very hard to imagine all the subtlety and the nuance that can go into visualizing a story and making it happen. So your job really is to think as if you are telling the story. So let's talk about telling stories. The first and most important thing that you should keep in mind, okay? I'm halfway through a thought, so come on in. First and most important thing to keep in mind as a storyteller is this. You know the story, but the reader doesn't. And that sounds like a really basic, obvious point. But when you start to unpack that idea, you can find that there's a lot of interesting things about that notion. Because what does that mean? It's like, I'm the storyteller, okay? I've got all this stuff in my head. I know everything. I know who all the characters are. I know what their relationships are to each other. I know their backstories. I know the world that the story exists in. I know what happens at the beginning. I know what happens in the middle. I know what happens at the end. How am I going to get that story out of my head to you? I can't open my head and invite you in. You wouldn't want to go there anyway. So somehow I've got to deliver this to you in small chunks that move you through the story that I'm trying to tell. Think about, have you ever heard somebody tell a joke and fail? Like, usually they do one of a couple of things wrong. They either forget a vital piece of information, right? They tell the joke, they forget something, they get to the punchline, nobody laughs. And they say, oh, I forgot there was a bear in the kayak. And, that was an important piece of information that should have been told. The other thing is the opposite. Maybe the punchline is very specific in its detail or in its wording, or there's a specific word in the punchline that is, that you need to make it work, and they give that away too early. They give up too much, right? And they're telling you, they give it away, and again, you get to the punchline, it's like too late. You can't go back. You can't say, oh, let me start again. So telling a joke of that kind is telling a story in a way. And what you have to do is you've got to line up the pieces of information in the right order so that the listener or the reader or the audience understands what's going on and gets it the way you want them to. And it's like, if you want the reader to know this, you have to think, well, in order for them to understand this, I have to tell them this first. In order to understand that, I have to tell them this first. So sometimes you have to think backwards about where your story's going and how to build to that place. So it's really about primarily being clear in what you're trying to say. So here's a story. A hare was making fun of a tortoise for being so slow. The tortoise got very offended and said, I will run a race with you, and I bet I'll win. The hare was very amused by this idea and said, sure, you're on. So they agree on the course, and when the race begins, the hare takes a commanding lead, running and running and running over hill and dale, and when the hare sees the finish line, he stops to catch his breath, turns around, sees that the tortoise is nowhere in sight, and thinks, I have time to take a nap and still win the race. Now, while the hare's asleep, the tortoise plods along, catches up with the hare, passes the hare. When the hare finally wakes up, realizes where he is, he dashes to the finish line, only to find that the tortoise has beat him there. There's a story. Clear. I don't think I left anything out. Also, not necessarily the most interesting way to tell that story. Okay, so clarity's good, but you want to go past just being clear. So how do you do that? Now you have to make it interesting. What makes it interesting? What makes a story interesting is the details. The specific details about the environment, about the world, in particular about the personalities of the characters involved. So then you start thinking, okay, how do I bring this story to life? How do I make it so that the reader is interested to know what happens next? Well, one way is you can think about, what's the story about? The story's about a race. No, it's not what the story's about. A race happens in the story, but the story's about something else. And you think, what is it? When you get to the end, what is it about? Okay, the story is about determination, right? The determination of the tortoise to keep going. Or maybe it's about arrogance, right? The hare is so arrogant that it's his own undoing. You think, oh, that's pretty good. That's like a classic theme, that a character's own actions can bring about his downfall. That's like the essence of tragedy. So let's say you decide that's what the story's about. You know how it ends with this humiliation of this arrogant character. So the way to set it up is, well, I've got to show how arrogant he is. So you go all the way back to the beginning, and from the moment we meet the hare, you have to make him the most arrogant, annoying, smug, narcissistic bully that you can think of. Offhand, I don't know if I can think of anybody like that. But use your imagination. And then, everything the hare does in the story has to follow through from that personality. That it seems like everything he says, every action he makes, reinforces this personality that you've built. So that when he does stop and take a nap, it makes perfect sense. That he's so overconfident. And just, you've established that to that point. So that's one way. And as the author of the story, right, you know all these little details. You know the little bits and pieces that make the story. So you're putting the details in. And another thing that can be interesting is the reader doesn't know which details might end up being important later on. The author knows. But the reader, everything is kind of equal for a while until it turns out something is not. So, for example, let's take the same story. Maybe early on in that tortoise and hare thing, somebody mentions something to the hare about, carrots as a prize. And you could have the hare say something like, carrots are for rabbits. Everyone knows that hares prefer lettuce. Right? And then you've got like a perfect line of dialogue that sort of follows through with his whole arrogant personality. But it just seems like one of many details until later in the story when he stops to catch his breath and he sees that the tortoise is nowhere to be found and he turns around and there's a whole field of lettuce.
Oh, no.
Then that one little line at the beginning of the story makes more sense, right? Because you've planted it there for it to pay off later on. Another thing you can do as the person in control of the story is it's like, well, I've got all this information, but I don't have to give it all at once. Here's a piece of information, here's another piece, here's another piece. Here's what I'm going to hold for a while. I'm not going to tell you. Right? Because that way you can also create some mystery, some suspense, keep the reader wondering, like, what's going to happen? Because you answer some questions, but you maybe leave something unanswered. And if you do it in an interesting enough way, the reader wants to keep reading and find out, when am I going to get the answer to that question? Now, sometimes the reader or the audience might not even know that you're keeping something back. Everybody here see Star Wars?
Yeah.
The real Star Wars, the first 3 movies?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, spoiler alert. So if you don't want to know what happened, plug yours. Imagine you're George Lucas, right? And you're coming up with Star Wars and you say, I know that Darth Vader is Luke's father, but the audience doesn't know. Now that's great power, right? To have that knowledge, right? So what do you do? So how do I tell them? And when do I tell them? Ooh, I know. I will lie to them at the beginning. I'll say, Darth Vader killed your father. Right? So now Luke and the audience all are going under the assumption that Darth Vader killed Luke's father. And everything that happens, that he builds the plot and eventually brings these two characters together, right? There's the confrontation finally, and they're battling with their lightsabers, and Luke says, you killed my father! Until Darth Vader says, no, Luke, I am your father. What did George Lucas do? He planted a time bomb at the beginning of movie 1, and it blew up at the beginning of end of movie 2. Right? And that gets us to the second most important thing that you should remember when telling a story. That is anybody here listen to Bob Dylan? How does Bob Dylan say that?
That was beautiful.
Thank you. That's beautiful. You want to remember that. So here's the thing. How does it feel when you find out that Darth Vader is your father? You want the reader to understand that on a visceral level. It's not enough to show it and put a caption that says, when Luke heard this, he was terrible. He felt terrible. That doesn't do it. You do what Lucas did, right? Luke is an orphan. He never knew his parents. He's being raised by his relatives. He finds out this guy, Darth Vader, killed his father that he never knew. And then as the story progresses, all the people that he loves get hurt or killed by this guy. Ooh, I dislike that Darth Vader so much. Right? And then finally when they get together, he says, it's because of you that my life is so miserable. He says, hey, I'm just your dad. Who can't relate to that, right? So everything you do in constructing the story, also you want to put yourself in the position of the characters and say, how would it feel to be in that situation? Whether it's, you know, just lost a job, or you're in a small room fighting 5 ninjas, you know, it's like, what would that feel like? And try to get that across in the way you're telling it. Even again, let's go back to the tortoise and the hare, right? There's a moment in that story that doesn't make any sense. Why would a tortoise challenge a hare to a race? That is not realistic. That doesn't happen in nature. So but you want to make it credible as the storyteller. So you think, okay, well, how do I make that credible? I mean, you know, Aesop's story says that that's what happened, so I better just draw it that way. No, make it so that it seems credible. And what would it be? There's any number of ways you can do it. You could have, it could be that the tortoise is just like totally zen. He just, no matter what happens, he is just cool with everything. The hare could be like the most obnoxious character in the world. He doesn't care. He sees right through him. He looks at the guy and says, he's all bluster and no follow through. You know, you think you're so fast, anybody could beat you in a race. What? You're on, Buster. Right? Or you take it a different way. The tortoise could be totally insecure. Right? And the hare is just relentless, going after him, teasing him, taunting him. He's down on the ground pretending to be a snail. Right? He's got a deck of cards. He's playing solitaire on his shell as he's walking by. Right? He's running in circles around him every time, going, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? In front of his girlfriend. So then finally the tortoise just can't take it anymore, and he says, that's enough. I challenge you to race. Oops. And then you say, okay, how do we play that out, right? And you let that develop as the two personalities. Okay, so storytelling. That pretty much covers what I want to say about that. How do we do it in comics? Now, comics offers lots of really interesting opportunities for telling stories because it's an interesting combination of words and pictures. As we said earlier, drawing, of course, is primary. And you can make, use drawing. You can make a great drawing of a hare. I'm not doing it right now. Running along at top speed, right? And just on the move, looking beautiful. Perfect, like poetry in motion, right? And then you can make another drawing of the tortoise, determined, eyes on the prize, taking a step, boom, going there. Both of them very descriptive drawings in their own right. But if you do that, you're not taking full advantage of the unique properties of comics. And one of the interesting, unique things about comics is that we see multiple images on a page at the same time. So if the race begins, and I draw a panel like this for the hare, and I draw a bunch of panels like this for the tortoise, okay? Right away, just by looking at those panels, I know a lot about the way these two animals move, and I haven't even drawn anything in the panels yet. Okay? Because this is one of the magic things about comics, is that it's not primarily about what the individual drawings are. It's about how one drawing or one image leads you to the next image. And simultaneously how that image follows through from the previous image. So there's always this flow going that what it's doing is it's creating the illusion of time and movement on a page where everything is static. Nothing on this page will ever move. Unless it's like 3 in the morning, you've been up for 48 hours. Maybe things start to look like they're moving. Other than that, this will always stay perfectly still. But it's this arrangement of panels and the imagery in them that gives us this illusion of liveliness, that things are actually happening. So using the panels on a comic page is really interesting for telling stories, because you can, when you have your information, you're structuring it within these panels, and there are different ways of doing it. You can set up a page where you have every panel the same size, and that creates a kind of equal rhythm of the way you read, and then you can break that at a certain point, right? Maybe you've got that rhythm going, and it gets interrupted by a larger panel, but you can also also use larger panels against smaller panels. You can take more than one action and condense them into a single drawing. You can also take an action and cut it up into bits to stretch it out. So you can play with this idea of the illusion of time, and whether it's just a physical action taking place, or whether it's somebody going through some kind of emotional change, and you use a bunch of panels to show that. You can manipulate things by the way you use the panels. Also, you can use, you can build repetitions into pages. Like, say you use a panel arrangement like this to show something, and use this same panel arrangement on the next page or on a page later in the story to reinforce something that you've established later. The reader might recognize that I've seen that arrangement before, or even the compositions of the panels might be the same. Or you have the characters. You have a close-up of a character's face right here in panel 1, and then things happen. And then we go to turn the page and we have the same thing, the close-up of the face again. But the expression's a little different, and then more things happen. And then you have the close-up of the face again, and more things happen. And you kind of chart what the character's going through by this repetition in the same place of the attitudes or the emotions that he's going through as the story takes place. It's another interesting thing you can do with comics because of the print medium. And you can even flip back and forth. It says once you've turned the page, you can't go back. You can read the comic any way you want. You can read it backwards, you can read it upside down. you can start here even though you're not supposed to. Which is why it's interesting to think about the fact that you are in control of this page as the comic artist. It's not like prose. You write prose, you write a sentence, it gets set in type, it gets printed, the sentence doesn't end at the bottom of the page, they continue it up here. In comics, you don't do that, you're drawing and drawing, and it's like, oh, I can only fit a third of the panel here, I better do the other 2/3 of the panel up there. Although that's a pretty interesting idea. You are in control of what this page is and what it means. When you think about, what do I want this page to mean? And how am I going to use the panels to arrange that information? And when you get to like a 2-page spread, which is how most pages are seen when the book is open, that makes it even more interesting, because then what happens on this page follows through to this page, but you can even have things sort of interacting visually in interesting ways. And you can also think about this as, what is this unit right here? Sometimes it makes sense to have a whole scene take place within these 2 pages, right? The start of the scene is here, the scene plays out, it ends, we turn the page, new scene, new time, new place, and you continue. And there's a kind of a completeness to that, where you can control it by the look of it, the way you arrange the panels, maybe the way the color is. On the other hand, you can also use this corner as a kind of a cliffhanger, right? Luke and Darth meet up here, they have their lightsaber battle, and at the bottom of the page, Luke says, "You killed my father?" "No, Luke." Turn the page, big panel, "I am your father." Right? That's using panel arrangement and pages, the physical properties of the comics, as part of your dramatic storytelling. Okay? So that's, now, of course, there's stuff that goes inside these panels. And again, that's how you place things, whether you put something right in the center, which is like the most stable, balanced place something can be, a character or an object, or whether you put something way over to the side here, or whether there's lots of stuff up here, and open space here, and a little thing down here. I mean, how you compose within the panel can also reinforce certain ideas, certain emotional states, and how you draw is also part of, if I draw a character like this, you're going to read the story in a certain way, as opposed to if I draw a character like this. Right? With all kinds of like serious looking line hatching and drawing and, you know, lighting effects and everything. Right? The drawing itself is giving you a signal to the reader how to approach this story. Right? Everything on the page is imparting some kind of information. In this case, even the style in which you present something, and not just the style of the drawing, but if you use words in your comic, most comics have, you know, pretty basic block lettering or stuff like that, but, you know, it doesn't have to. You need a chisel marker for this. If you've got something like this, like that, or like that, or like that. You know, if you see a character saying that word these different ways, it's going to evoke some different feeling in your head, that you're kind of hearing these different words expressed in a different way, or it tells you something about the personality of the speaker. And not just the words, but let's say you do stick with your kind of basic block lettering comics. lettering that we're used to seeing in comics. That sounded good. You all know these, right? Everybody recognize these?
Yeah.
Okay, this is just your starting point. The word balloons also can be very expressive. They can tell a lot about what's being said. Here's a kind of an interesting classic one. Right? Chili. What happens if... Should have left more room here. If you do that, right? Or this.
Yeah.
How do you read that word balloon? Right? There's a lot going on in that word balloon. I'd like to see the person saying that. Right? And if you use text, not just the fact that it is visual and it's part of your drawing, you draw a panel and you've got a burning house and a guy running out of the house, and you're using text. Do not put in this caption, John fled the burning house. Okay? Because that is just a wasted space. And it's not telling me anything. Tell me something I don't know. If I see a picture like this, tell me John's worst fear was realized. Right? Because then now you're telling me something I can't see. And if I read that, John's worst fear was realized, I don't know what it is until I see the picture. So then you're using two levels of information coming together, which is like the best usage of words and pictures in comics. To have those you're doing double duty in a panel, and which is why comics can often carry more information than they seem to in a page. I see a lot of comics where things are dragged out, conversations are dragged out, they look like stills from a movie. But it's kind of like adapting movie writing to comics rather than taking advantage of what comics can do that other media can't do. Okay. So, get back to my question. How do you draw comics? Well, think like a storyteller. Right? You know what the story is. Deliver it to the reader in ways that surprise the reader and make them want to keep reading. How does it feel, right? Put yourself in the position of the characters. Try to get the emotional reality of every scene and every situation out in the way you construct scenes, the way you deliver them visually, the way you use dialogue. And then use all the visual tools that the medium of comics affords you. Everything that I talked about up here, you know, the how you draw, the style of the drawing, the way you organize panels, the way you structure them graphically throughout the story, the way you use lettering visually, right? But also the size of the page, you know? And a reading experience is different if the page is this big or if it's that big. The color of the paper. All of this stuff is information that imparts something to the reader. Comics, everything the reader apprehends about the story is coming visually in one way or another. So, to use all of those things you can, that's how you draw comics. It does help if the stronger your drawing skills are, the easier it is to take advantage of a lot of these things as well. So I think we might have time for a few questions. If